Okay, welcome everyone to Kremlin File. And today we have an honored guest, David Kramer. He was Senior Director for Human Rights and Democracy at the McCain Institute and also President of Freedom House. A number of senior posts in the government, including Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor at the State Department.
Yeah, and we had him on last year before the war, and he, was again sounding the alarm, as he has been for over the past decade, of what a threat Putin is.
So we're really eager to see his views on what has happened and then where he sees this going. So without any further ado, let's welcome David to the pod. David, how are you?
I'm great, Monique. It's great to see you and Olga, and it's great to be back. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you back. Okay,
welcome back.
Welcome. We've got lots and lots of questions, so let's just jump in. All right. David, I wanted to ask you something about our reaction, the reaction of the West to Russia's renewed aggression against Ukraine. Before, we saw them in Georgia. Okay. We saw them, let's say, the aggression again in Crimea, in the Donbass, all right, 2014, 15, and then continuing up until now. We also saw in Syria, all right. What do you think actually triggered the West to act now, whereas before they didn't? I know it's a big question, but I'm interested to know what your take on this is.
I think in this case, Monique, it is the West is getting fed up with Putin and has finally, belatedly, after all the litany of egregious behavior that you cited, has recognized him as an existential threat. That if he is not stopped in Ukraine, he likely will go on, whether it's toward a NATO member state or toward Moldova, Georgia, whatever the case may be. He has essentially already taken over Belarus for all intents and purposes. But in this case, this is such an egregious violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, a wholly unprovoked, unjustified invasion of Ukraine, that with it has come just heart-wrenching war crimes, crimes against humanity. And it is also because the West and the United States in particular, its intelligence agencies, knew this was coming. They knew it was coming. And so I think credit to the West this time for having the right analysis and predicting that the invasion was coming. Credit to the Biden administration and European allies for preparing an unprecedented regime of sanctions against Putin and Russia. And credit for the military buildup in NATO member states that border Ukraine and or Russia. A belated credit to the administration for the delivery of military equipment and weapons to Ukraine. And there, I think the administration deserves some criticism. And I think the intelligence community deserves criticism for this because they got it wrong. They anticipated that Russia would go in and that this would be over quickly and that this would be a kind of cakewalk. There, the intelligence community was kind of mirroring the same thinking that existed in Moscow, where the Russians also thought that they would be able to go in and be embraced essentially as liberators by the Ukrainians from the quote unquote Nazis that the Kremlin keeps talking about, which of course is absurd. And so as a result of misreading the Ukrainians' ability to defend themselves and overestimating the Russians' capability, I think the administration and other Western governments were reluctant to provide military assistance because they figured it wouldn't make a difference. And this is where I don't understand their thinking. They worried that providing significant military assistance in the lead up to the invasion would be provocative. It would provoke Putin. And yet they had intel showing them that he was going to invade anyway. So if he's going to invade anyway, what was stopping them from preparing the Ukrainians as much as possible with as much military assistance? The last thing I'll say is I also think the administration, I've given them credit for all the things they got right, but stop telling Putin what you won't do. It is just a strategic blunder in saying the U.S. won't put forces on the ground. I'm not arguing with that position. I think that's the right position to take. but you don't need to telegraph to your enemy what your limitations are. Keep Putin guessing. And then there's also the whole way they've handled certain military assistance from, say, Poland and other countries. They've gotten much better. There's a lot more military assistance going in. Credit for what they've gotten right, but also it's important to learn from what they screwed up.
Yeah.
That day in December, when Biden announced no troops on the ground, I mean,
it was a cringe moment.
It wasn't even cringe.
He kept repeating it. So one time maybe you say it, because I also recognize, look, the president of the United States has an American audience he has to address. He's not just addressing a Russian audience or Ukrainian audience.
Right.
But to keep saying it was I think just a real blunder. Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you think?
Yeah, and it gave Putin even more confidence to just go ahead because he knew he wouldn't face.
Yeah, exactly.
And in that case, they should have just not said anything.
Correct.
I mean, the American audience wouldn't, weren't asking, are Americans getting involved? So they could have just not mentioned anything at all, like you said.
Yeah. In fact, I think also with the intelligence, it's not just the Americans that got it wrong, in the sense that even the Europeans themselves, Germany, France, everybody was thinking, okay, Ukraine will not be able to withstand a Russian onslaught. So it was,
and it was outside experts too. It wasn't just government agencies that got what would happen if Russia invaded wrong. There were a number of very highly respected military analysts outside the U.S. government, outside European governments, who anticipated the same thing. And they underestimated the difference between Ukraine of 2014 and Ukraine of 2022, where there has been huge advancements. They underestimated the role of morale in this war, where the Ukrainians are fighting for their country, they're fighting for their freedom, they're fighting for their lives. The Russians who have been sent there have no idea why they're there. They're invading what Putin had described last July as one people. And so they're wondering, why are we bombing our own people, so to speak? And so, for all of that, I think it needs to be examined once the dust settles, because it affected policy. It kept the administration and Western governments from moving ahead with military assistance when they should have, because they underestimated the Ukrainians and they overestimated the Russians. A lot of the analysis in government and out of government painted Russia as this, 80-foot giant that was invincible. And look at the numbers of Russians reportedly that have been killed. It's approaching 30,000 troops.
Yeah,
the number of tanks, aircraft, ships, and things that have been destroyed by the Ukrainians. It is both a reflection of Ukrainians' capabilities and skill and determination and heroism, also their leadership under President Zelensky, versus an utterly incompetent mission that was given to Russian forces by Putin, by the Russian generals. And it doesn't seem to be getting a much better for the Russian side. It's, of course, been brutal and devastating for Ukrainians on the receiving ends of both indiscriminate and discriminate bombings by the Russians, because some of these bombings are deliberately targeting maternity wards and hospitals and schools and shelters, theaters where people are hiding, steel plants in Mariupol and other places. So, I mean, it's just been barbaric, the campaign that has been conducted. And I think we shouldn't have underestimated that either. Monique, you mentioned Syria, the bombing of Aleppo. We can also go back to how Putin came to power in 99 and 2000 with the leveling of Grozny. Unfortunately, this is not out of character for Russian forces in the 21st century.
Yeah. And what he did to his own people, even before even undertaking.
Chechens are Russian citizens.
Yeah,
absolutely. And if he's going to do it to his own people, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. We will circle back, to Putin and towards the end, because we have a question for you then on that. In terms of what you were saying of Russian losses on the ground, the ISW, right, the Institute for War Studies, had estimated, I think, 30% attrition rate. This is their estimates based on what they can find, so on and so forth. This is just a little bit of background information for whoever is listening. But let me ask you something really personal, David. What were you thinking on, like, the lead up, say the 2 weeks before, and about February the 24th? What was going through your head? What did you feel because it's important that we all remember, that those moments, okay, so that they don't come again. That's my feeling. All right, what's yours? What did you?
I was going back and forth on whether they would in fact go ahead with the invasion. I certainly wasn't ruling it out, but I also wasn't certain that it would happen, in part because I was applying my sort of Western rational way of thinking, which I knew was not the way Putin thinks. And yet I couldn't help it, because I had argued that the Ukrainians actually would put up a hell of a fight, and that Putin would be making a mistake. And so I figured, if I knew that, then Putin and the generals in Moscow had to have known that. And so it just seemed to me to be so unnecessary and unjustified and unprovoked and uncalled, every unword you can think of. And,
we get that.
And yet it happened.
Yeah.
So I was still living in Miami before I moved to Dallas on February 24th. And I was at Florida International University, and we were hosting a conference. And it was a conference with people from Europe, a small conference, not a major one. And we had a Ukrainian there. And so I was supposed to make welcoming opening remarks, and I broke down. I couldn't believe what was happening. I just felt so horrible for Oleg and for his compatriots back home. And as the two of you, we've been to Ukraine many times. We've been to Russia many times. We have Russian and Ukrainian friends, Olga in particular. I mean, it's heart-wrenching to see these two countries go to war with each other, and it's all because one man woke up one day and decided this is what he wanted to do, that this is what he thought would serve his corrupt, authoritarian personal interests, not his country's interests. There's no way this serves Russia's national interests, but Putin thought it served his own interests. And look at the devastating toll that has been exacted on the Ukrainian people.
Devastating. Absolutely.
Yeah, on Ukrainian people. And also, for Russia, they lost close to 30,000, like you said, in a few months versus 15,000 with the Soviets in Afghanistan over a decade. That's a huge, huge toll, and that even shows not only the morale, because I remember I was following it very, very closely on the ground and getting all the chatter from outside when Russia was on the border with Ukraine. The morale then was bad. There were COVID outbreaks. The troops were parked on Ukraine's border for months. Yeah, and it was just like, even then they didn't understand what they were doing. And again, some do, because some, you have. This is where it's very conflicting, because on one end you have soldiers who didn't want to go, and and some of them even defected or surrendered, and then you have others who have that like Russian nationalist mentality, and you see the evils that they are doing, which goes back to their differences with Ukraine over the past century or few centuries. And we saw that coming out in Bucha, and we saw that coming out in other, where it's like such a personal killing, mass killing, that, it's not even, like you see even between Syria, where they wiped out villages. But here you see them actually like ripping out tongues of people, and the torture, and just because they have this personal feeling of we have to settle this finally. So it's very, the whole situation is just horrific.
It is. And, it comes back to what we touched on before, which is the abusive, dehumanizing treatment of their own citizens in Chechnya, for example. And so if they're not going to respect the rights of their own people, the Chechens we mentioned, but the way they treat protesters, ethnic Russians, killing journalists, killing opposition figures, poisoning people. This is what they do to their own people, whether inside or outside Russia's borders. And so if they do that to their own people, this is not a shock that they're going to treat other people this way, whether they're Syrians or Georgians or Ukrainians or Belarusians. And so there's a long track record here.
We wanted to talk to you today about athletic greens.
I started taking it a few months ago because, we all put on COVID weight.
I'm terrible with vitamins, but this has it all.
And I do it first thing in the morning. 1 scoop.
Tastes
Shake it
fantastic.
up. Drink it.
Yeah.
It does. It tastes so good. And it gives me so much energy. Like I drink it and then I'll have my coffee and it gives me this boost of energy that, it's amazing. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give you a free 1-year supply of immune supporting vitamin D and 5 travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/Kremlin file. athleticgreens.com/Kremlin file to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance.
Belarus, David, can you give us a bit of an update? What's happening there?
Sure. So, of course, Lukashenko is tremendously dependent on Putin for staying in power. After he stole the August 2020 election and then launched a brutal crackdown on peaceful protesters in Belarus, he has basically subjugated Belarus to Russian control. And I would argue without Putin's support, Lukashenko would have been gone by now. Putin came in with financial support. Remember, he sent TV presenters to replace Belarus TV presenters who resigned out of protest. He's provided security assistance, including ammunition to deal with protesters. And then, of course, there have been the military exercises between Russia and Belarus. And then after the latest Zapad exercise, the Russian forces stayed on Belarus territory. So what Lukashenko did do, yes, you're right, he didn't send in his own troops across the border into Ukraine, in part because I think he knew if he did that, he would have had a revolt on his hands. But he did allow Belarus territory to be used by Russian forces and Russian military activity to launch bombing raids and other campaigns into Ukrainian territory. I mean, that's where the campaign toward Kyiv came from Belarus territory. So. But what's also interesting is a lot of the Russians who have been killed and injured have been sent back to Belarus for handling. And so in some respects, Lukashenko, to the extent he's learning about this, is getting an inside scoop on what's happening to the Russian forces, how badly they're doing. And so interestingly, he gave an interview to the Associated Press about a week or 10 days ago. In which he offered some mild criticism of the military campaign, saying it had dragged on longer than he thought it would. And so he seems to be up to his old tricks of hinting toward the West that he said he wants to play the role of peacemaker. He wants to help end the fighting. And so he's up to his old tricks again, where on the one hand, he's trying to offer an olive branch to the West to see if they'll bite. On the other hand, he's so dependent on Putin, he can't risk crossing him. And so just the other day, he was in Moscow for a meeting of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. And so Lukashenko is really in a vice right now. And you've seen people in Belarus actually try to sabotage some of the rail lines that go from Belarus into Ukraine to block the Russian advance. You've seen other efforts by people. There's little support, from what we can tell, inside Belarus for the Russian military campaign, because they recognize that Lukashenko has allowed them to become a pawn in this. And so I do think that if Putin is in trouble, and I actually think there is a chance he could be for this terrible decision he's made to invade Ukraine, Lukashenko will follow immediately after. Lukashenko is so dependent on Putin for staying in power that if Putin's position is weakened and he's not able to sustain that support, Belarus could see brighter days ahead as well.
Let's hope so. Let's
Indeed.
hope so. Let's hope it all falls, And then we were talking to Olga, because you had made some comments about Transnistria and Georgia, right? You know, how there are pockets and problems there as well. Should we start with Georgia, David?
Sure. So, as we were talking before, in Ossetia, the so-called leader there has talked about a referendum to join with Russia. And as you know, Russia has recognized South Ossetia and Abkhazia as independent states. But if they were to actually be annexed by Russia, become so-called Russian territory, then any military activity conducted by Georgia or other kinds of activity would then be interpreted as an attack on Russia itself. The challenge, though, is that in some respects, Putin is getting what he wants from the current Georgian leadership anyway. Where you have Benzina Ivanishvili, the oligarch, pulling the strings behind the scenes, former prime minister after the 2012 elections, rather, is the one who tells Prime Minister Garibashvili what to do. And so the Georgians have not joined sanctions, for example, against Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. They have criticized the Ukrainian government. There have even been comments by the Speaker of the Parliament and the head of the Georgian Dream Party suggesting that the Ukrainians provoked this crisis themselves. The Ukrainians recalled their ambassador from Georgia. And so a whole slew of problems that have emerged where the Georgians seem to be on a page very different from the rest of the international, or at least the Western community. And the Russians, I think, are getting their way anyway, so they may not have to do anything militarily in Georgia. Moldova, by contrast, very pro-Western government, the most pro-Western government they've had, led by Maya Sandu. The Russians, I think, want to do whatever they can to try to destabilize the situation there. They, of course, have forces on the ground, not a lot, but around 1,200 forces. But even a fair number of those are actually Transnistrians in the Transnistrian separatist region of Moldova. There's an arms depot there that poses a problem. And there have been some unexplained explosions on the Transnistrian territory over the past few weeks. And so the concern, I think, there is that Moldova sort of sits just beyond Odessa and might be viewed in Moscow, at least, as easy pickings, as low-hanging fruit. I don't mean to make light of the situation there, but Putin is in desperate need of a victory. And I do worry that he may view Moldova as a quick victory, because Moldova doesn't have the military capabilities that Ukraine has, of course. It is a much more divided country. But right now it has a very pro-Western government, and Putin may want to try to deal with it. Keep in mind, so what do these three countries have in common that leaves them vulnerable? None of them is in NATO. And so I think this is a reminder to us that countries that are in this gray zone, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, even Belarus in a kind of different respect, are vulnerable to Russian pressure. I don't think Putin wants a conflict and a war with NATO, certainly not with the United States, but he views these countries who aren't in NATO as ones that are ripe for the picking, if you will. And so I think it underscores the need to think about membership for those countries who want it, whether it is Ukraine and Georgia, who were promised it in 2008, or Finland and Sweden, which just in the past few days have applied for membership.
That's right. They signed. Okay. Yeah, no, it's absolutely amazing. In fact, we're going to be talking about this specifically, the whole of the changes to the security structure and infrastructure all across, or architecture all across, right, Europe, and how this is probably one of the most monumentous achievements, let's say, of NATO, to be able to expand, and especially with Finland and with Sweden. Sweden was neutral for like 200 years. And so we can thank Putin. He was awarded, actually, by Darth Putin, he was awarded the best NATO employee. Sorry, I had to crack that one.
Yes.
I just laughed. Darth is here with us.
Yeah, he really is. I wanted to follow up on something with that, because I actually just wrote an article for SIPA on Russia wanting to avoid a direct conflict with NATO or with the US. And I cited a very fascinating thing I saw developing inside of Russia with the ship Moskva. So Russia, over the past few months, has blamed U.S. for everything. I mean, we've sent mercenaries in, chemical weapons, a dirty bomb, anything and everything you can name. They have blamed us. And I mean, this goes back for the past 70 years. They blame us if, a mountain, like if there's a volcano eruption, it's like, the CIA did it. So they've always blamed us for everything. Over the past few months with Ukraine, they've been setting the stage that we are, responsible for everything and whatever. But with Moscow, they refused to acknowledge there was an attack. What's even more so interesting, that there was the intel reports that came out via New York Times that U.S. Intelligence provided, information, logistical information for that targeting. All Russian media ignored it, except one outlet that's connected to FSB, Russia's intelligence services. They posted the headline. It stayed up. It was short-lived. It disappeared off their site. It's still found via Google search, but the article doesn't exist. But they did that. So where U.S. potentially, we don't know how true these intelligence reports are, but where U.S. potentially may have been involved in providing intelligence, Russia completely ignores. They don't want nothing, because I feel like Putin didn't want to be put in a corner, because then Russians would demand for him to respond. So going back to Moldova, I found something very interesting developing. There was a GRU agent who was one of the key players for annexing Crimea and for occupation of Donbass, Igor Strelkov or Gherkin. Yeah. So he, right before the explosions, he gave an interview to the same actually Russian outlet that's an FSB front. He gave an interview to them, and he said he had insider, which is BS, information that Romanians had crossed into Moldova, and there was some warehouse, and they had Moldovan uniforms for police and security forces and military, and Romanians were going to throw these uniforms on and start, a war inside of Moldova and attack Transnistria. Do you think that Russia, like you said, does not want a direct confrontation with NATO, but can they do something like that, create a false flag operation where they potentially attempt to pull in Romania, or on the other side of Poland?
Well, sure. I mean, I think any false flag operation is possible on their part. We in the United States, with our intelligence agencies, have done a good job in exposing a lot of these false flag operations, almost disarming them, if you will, preempting them by disclosing them. And I think that's been very effective. But I will believe it more if we issue a warning that this kind of operation is underway, rather than listening to Strelkov, Gherkin, whatever name he wants to use.
Okay.
It's not to say that he's wrong. He's actually been quite critical of Putin with the conduct of the war in Ukraine. Yes. And of course, we just saw on Russian TV earlier this week a retired colonel offering criticism as well. It's these things are signs that things aren't going well. The Lukashenko interview with AP, the guy on Russian TV on the 60 Minutes program this week, the Strelkov, and of course Leonid Ivashov before the war issued a pretty blistering statement criticizing the Kremlin for even thinking about an invasion. So this is a sign when things aren't going well, when the rats start jumping ship. And it seems like some of these rats are jumping ship. Lukashenko is one of the biggest rats around, of course. And so, when you start seeing this, but just to reinforce your point, Olga, remember there are two incidents in the past, 7 years, that underscore how the Russians don't want to have a war or conflict with NATO. November 2015, when a Russian military jet violated Turkish airspace repeatedly. The Turks warned it. The Russians didn't listen, and the Turks shot it down and killed two pilots. And the Russians huffed and puffed, but they didn't do anything. In fact, the Russian ambassador was assassinated a couple months later. Then in February 2018, In Syria, again, Syria's sort of got the common denominator here. In Syria, again, Wagner mercenaries, about 400 Wagner mercenaries were threatening U.S. forces in Syria. We warned them to back off. They didn't. U.S. military planes then bombed them and killed almost all of them.
Yeah.
2 to 3, between 200 to 400 Russian citizens, Wagner mercenaries, not the nicest guys in the world. The Russians didn't say anything. Again, they don't care what happens to their own people, even the bad guys they send into these conflicts. And yet they also don't want to ratchet up tensions. Yes, they'll threaten use of nuclear weapons. Yes, they'll threaten to bomb the supplies that are coming in. But for all intents and purposes, they haven't done that because we are sending in lots of military equipment now to Ukraine to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. And the Russians don't seem to be doing much about it at all. There was that bombing the other day in Lviv, but again, they're not stopping the supplies going in. It underscores, one, that they don't want the conflict with NATO, and two, they're utterly incompetent.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that was going to be my question. Do you think
incompetent,
yeah,
corrupt?
Exactly. Well, that was my question. Like, why they simply cannot, because they can't do it right now, in the sense that they just don't have the capabilities. They don't have the coordination that would take.
Well, I mean, you cited the numbers of killed compared to the campaign in Afghanistan. Look at the number of generals that have been killed.
Yeah.
I mean, they're having to send generals to the front line because they don't have confidence in the colonels and others who are there. And as a result, a number of generals are getting killed. And here, too, there may be a role of Western intelligence helping the Ukrainians identify and spot them. But it isn't just Western intelligence. A lot of these Russians, the forces, the lower level grunt troops, if you will, as well as some of the officers, are using personal cell phones, which exposes them to the Ukrainian side and helps them with targeting. So again, it's a horrible job of provisions of food, energy, fuel, weapons. And the Russian campaign has gone about as badly as one could possibly imagine. And so for all the supposedly overwhelming quantity advantage that Russia has had, the quality has just been absolutely awful. And there are outside factors too. I mean, Turkish drones have made a difference in this campaign. Erdogan's playing some games now over Finland and Sweden's interest in joining NATO. But Turkey has been providing Ukraine with a lot of military assistance that has had a major impact on the battlefield. Our own drones, the Switchblades and others, have also been very helpful. So, and this is where I think we have to think about that the Ukrainians are being replenished. They are getting outside assistance to help them carry out and conduct this campaign. The Russians are not. They're having to bring in Syrians who aren't going to be able to make any difference. Wagner mercenaries who, maybe are former military, but they're basically just throwing people into the mix here. And there was no mobilization announced by Putin on May 9th. But even if he did, if he mobilized people, first of all, they're going to come from Moscow and St. Petersburg, which isn't going to be popular. No. He's relied mostly on soldiers coming from the poorer regions because they don't have an alternative. And moreover, it takes months to train people to go into a battle situation. And if he just throws them in without any preparation, they will just be slaughtered. But Putin doesn't care. And so this is why I think we can, for the first time, talk about the possibility, I'm not predicting this, but the possibility of a sudden Russian military collapse. Because the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives. They have morale on their side. They have the West on their side. The Russians don't have morale on their side. They don't have the West is opposed to them, as hit them with massive sanctions. And I just wonder how long Russian soldiers are going to be willing to put up with this, and how long Russian generals and how long Russian FSB officers are going to be willing to take the bullet for Putin, almost literally.
And GRU.
And so I think we can, for the first time, talk about this possibility. And if the military collapses, Putin is finished. And then we have to start thinking about scenarios in a post-Putin Russia.
I want to go down that road.
I'll never No, I was going to say, I'll never forget reading an article, and then I had it confirmed of a Russian, I think, general meeting with U.S. military attaché in Moscow, I think a few months ago. And they asked him, like, oh, so what do you think? Didn't you grow up in Ukraine? And he was like, and he, who's a very stoic general, doesn't, very disciplined, very trained, made a comment basically like, what do you think? And then just like walked out. And that's also another thing I think that Putin failed, because there's so much crossover between Russians and Ukrainians. Like, I'm living proof of it. I'm both,
Absolutely.
and there are plenty who are either both or have family, friends, in both countries. So I think that's another thing. And then you add the corruption. I mean, the corruption of stealing everything and the contracts and everything from Russian military.
It's a great point. Absolutely right.
Basically, you see the results of Putin's
I mean, that's such an important point, because
Mm-hmm.
everyone was getting worked up about the Russian military modernization and everything, but we discounted the role that corruption played in undermining that modernization effort. Absolutely right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
There's a great article about that, how the misconception in the West was arrived at through simple going and putting a little too much emphasis on the numbers and not looking like on quantity, but not on quality, and also on the whole corruption. I mean, look, we right, Olga, we've been talking about oligarchs and we've been talking about Russia for over a year, right? And you've been doing research on them forever and a day. So it's incredible how this was.
They robbed everything.
Well, this is what I mean. It's incredible how this was miscalculated, right? Not taking into account something key, which is a key.
Here, though. Yeah, it's here, because my mom is Russian, right? And when like she kept watching the news and she's like, oh, this mighty Russian military, she was laughing. She was like, what mighty military? Like, the hospitals in Russia have like holes and rust and holes in the ceiling. She's like, these people rob everything, like out of, I don't know, $1 million contract. By the time that the actual money gets to invest into what that contract, it's probably like 200,000. Everything else goes into everybody's pocket. And it's like, the corruption there is, I mean, so out of control. And now you see the result, because I'm military. I mean, I
mean, one thing along those lines is, who's going to want to buy a Russian tank after this?
Yeah,
who's going to want to buy a Russian military vehicle? It's true. Russian arms sales, as you know, have been important to Russia's economy. Yeah. And after this campaign, after the display of how the Russian military equipment performs, who's going to want to buy this stuff? Unless it's at a tremendous discount. I mean, it's just the corruption, the poor quality. But maybe the last thing I would say is, you have to look at the motivation. Why are the Ukrainians fighting? They're fighting for their country. They're fighting for their freedom. They're fighting for their families. They know why they are fighting. They don't understand why they're being attacked, but they know why they're fighting. The Russians who have been sent there have no clue why they're invading Ukraine. I mean, as you were just saying, Olga, about the ties between the two countries. And Putin, we mentioned this before. Putin talked about the one people, and the justifications that the Kremlin kept drumming up were ridiculous. Moving targets, denazification. The Ukrainians were pursuing nuclear weapons. They were going to allow NATO to station forces on their territory. Just one absurd theory after another, and none of them held up. And so as a result, it's a mess for the Russians and for Putin. And you're right, for families whose sons and fathers and brothers have been sent to the war and either won't come back or will come back in body bags. But not a great deal of sympathy for them, but tremendous sympathy for the Ukrainians, but also just a huge salute to the Ukrainian people, military and civilian, who have stepped up to defend their country with great leadership by President Zelensky. I mean, talk about a person stepping into the role of a wartime president. He has done it brilliantly. And, Slava Ukraina.
Yeah. Yep. And we have to keep up our part.
And you mentioned you had written...
Yep.
No, we also have to keep up our part, right? Up on
Absolutely.
this.
Absolutely.
Because I'm starting to see some
question.
really disturbing signs coming out of Europe. And I don't want to get into this like really into depth, but I'm actually quite worried that not so much the States, because I can see, right? And maybe you can answer this, David and Olga, but what I'm seeing from my part over here is that already between France, Germany, and Italy, they're already starting to say, well, let's see, how the peace has to come. The peace has to come. They're not defining it. We're starting to get sort of that air or winds of appeasement, which is totally unacceptable. What's your view on this, David?
Yeah, I mean, and President Macron has tried to reach out and talk to Putin about this. The Ukrainians are confident. They think they're going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And just yesterday, it seemed that the negotiations that had now moved to a virtual format have ended. The Ukrainians are fed up. The Russians aren't taking it seriously. And I think Zelensky feels that he has the possibility of regaining a lot of Ukrainian territory that was seized not just in this latest round of war, but going back to 2014. Crimea might be a little harder down the road, but the Ukrainians are making significant inroads here, and the Russians are not. And so I think we have to follow the Ukrainian lead. They're the ones doing the fighting. They're the ones who are dying on the battlefield. It's not. Their
country.
The least we can do is to make some sacrifices when it comes to filling up our gas tanks, going to the grocery store. They're not asking us to send our forces to fight for them. They are asking us to send the military means so that they can defend themselves. And, shame on us if we start suffering from fatigue from this. They're the ones on the front lines dealing with this night and day. They're the ones whose homes are being destroyed. They're suffering terrible losses, but they're also showing tremendous bravery and heroism and determination. At the least, as you say, Monique, we can do is to get behind them and support.
Yeah, well, it's quite scary. It's also another thing too is that they've sort of what I'm hearing a lot is that sort of the respect for a Ukrainian agency is not there.
Absolutely.
And this is something that bothers me quite a bit because it is their country and they should be deciding exactly what they want, what kind of peace they want, when they're going to be ready for that. And it's not up to us. We are there to defend. They're defending our democracy. They're defending our values. Okay.
Absolutely.
So this is something that I feel very, very strongly about as you said, Slava Ukraini to all of our friends. Yes.
I just don't understand it because, I don't even understand. You know what it is? I think the West likes to have everything kind of sorted with kind of like
nice
all wrapped up, packaged, nice, neat. And they keep offering this, the negotiations. Like, how do you negotiate with a leader who launched a genocide campaign? This is more than even just a mass murder or, the mass graves. This is a genocide campaign. They're targeting and striking all cultural centers in Ukraine. They're trying to erase Ukrainian heritage. So how do you sit at a table and what do you negotiate? Where does it even begin? Can we exist, please?
David, what do we do with a problem like Putin? I wrote an article on this. Let's see how should we be dealing with him?
Treat him as the pariah he is. I would argue we don't ease up on any sanctions as long as he remains in power. He is off limits. I think, President Biden has called him a war criminal, a thug, a murderer. He has used the word genocide. He said, and I actually was not bothered by what he said at all when he said, for God's sakes, this man cannot remain in power. He wasn't saying U.S. policy is regime change.
Right.
He was expressing a sentiment that I would hope we could all get behind, frankly.
Sure.
And so there should be no business as usual. I support taking frozen Russian assets and actually seizing them and using them for reconstruction of the Ukraine. I can't imagine how we could return any of those assets to Russia after the damage that Putin has inflicted on Ukraine. So I think keep the pressure up as much as possible. Don't talk about off-ramps. Don't talk about exits. Don't talk about face-saving ways ahead. That is Putin's problem. He has control over the narrative in Russia for now, at least. He can create his own off-ramps and exits. Timothy Snyder actually posted a tweet.
It's a great
Twitter
tweet
thread, whatever it's called. I don't tweet, but somebody sent it to me.
Yes.
It is a great tweet. Agree completely. That's his problem, not ours.
Yeah.
So keep the pressure on and recognize him for the evil he is, frankly.
Yes, we agree. We agree. We agree.
And I want to have one follow-up question, which I've been observing, and I ignored it at the beginning until I see serious people now picking it up. So Russian intelligence services seem to be, having fun and putting out that Putin is sick. Putin is about to have surgery. Putin is dying. Then Putin's mistress, Kabayeva, just got pregnant again, and he found out. I mean, it's so much nonsense. And David, in Russia, someone easily can die, a senior figure, and, they'll cover it up for months until they figure it out. So they're putting this out. My concern is, because now it's really become, went from British rag outlets to now it's becoming more mainstream. My concern is, do you think Putin is preparing to put a new face on the Kremlin? And if so, you said keep the sanctions, keep everything as long as Putin is there. What if he attempts to, pretend to step aside or pretend something and put a new face on the Kremlin, but it's still the same generals, same leadership, same Security Council, and same.
It's a good question. So let me amend my answer to Monique, which is as long as the Putin system remains in power, certainly as long as Putin stays in power, but as long as the system does. You're absolutely right. I mean, he played games in 2008 with the switcheroo with Medvedev. No one really fell for that. And but it is interesting that these stories and rumors are coming out. He doesn't look great, and I don't know what's wrong with him. I'm not sure anyone does. But I also don't have any sympathy for him whatsoever. This is a man who has inflicted so much damage on his own people, on his neighbors, on Syrians and others. And so, maybe it's a sign that people are not as fearful as they were. But he obviously is trying to instill fear in people and in the system, because that's how he operates. He can't operate based on popular support. He operates based on instilling fear and hope that people will self-censor as well as recognize the risk they face if they go out and protest. Yeah. So keep the pressure on him and the system. You're absolutely right to point that out.
Yeah. Well, we didn't deal with him before. We let it all go. We appeased. We went along for various reasons. Each country had their own reasons, so on and so forth. This is the perfect opportunity to stick with our values and what we've set out since and also in complete support of Ukraine, because this is what is necessary.
Best way actually to help Russia. Support Ukraine and the other countries in the region.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the best way to do it.
Exactly. Okay.
Great.
David, this has been such a great chat. As always,
thank you very much to both of you.
Come along. Thank you. Hey everybody, if you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe and please visit our website, kremlinfile.com. This is a Bunker Crew Media production, hosted by Olga Lautman and me, Monique Camarra, with executive producers Marley Clements, Jack Bryan, Grant DeSimone, Ben, Brett, and Jordy Mycelis of Meidas Media, with associate producers Ruby Frankel and Sarah Metz. Theme music by Oreste Camarra. Sound editing and mixing by Joy Ellett. Subscribe to Kremlin File wherever you listen to podcasts.
Oh, we are recording.
All right. No, that's okay. We'll cut out